Hello and welcome to the Glossy Podcast. I'm senior fashion reporter Danny Parisi, and I'm very excited today to be speaking with Quaid Walker, who you may have heard a few months ago joining me on the Week in Review podcast. Quaid is the founder and CEO of Bezel, a secondhand watch marketplace with over $500 million worth of watch listings only 3 years after its founding. So I'm going to be asking Quaid not just about the watch business, which is booming and competitive, but also about how you scale up a company organically, maintain momentum, maintain company culture, all that kind of stuff. Quaid, thank you so much for being here for your second time on the Glossy Podcast. How are you?
I'm well, and thanks for having me back. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, I was just saying I have a personal interest in watches. I have a very meager, pathetic collection, but I do love reading about them, and it's the job that I like a lot is just talking about watches and writing about it. So I'm really excited that we're going to be able to dive in. I mentioned this in my little intro there, but you guys have grown quite significantly since 2021 is when the company was started, right? Can you remind me how long were things percolating before the 2021 launch?
Yeah, so we quit our jobs and went full time with this in August of 21. We were kind of percolating and building until June of 22, and that's when we officially launched the business. And then we really announced ourselves in almost January of 23. And I think a lot of our build process was we're selling very expensive items, and ostensibly what we are selling is trust. And so we wanted to make sure we could do well on the promise we wanted for our earliest customers. So we took a lot of time to make sure the process was thoughtfully perfected before we did the initial launch. So it was a lot of percolation there. And obviously the watch market was in the highest it ever was in August of 21 through 22. And then it's moved a lot and shifted as we've existed since then.
Okay, so actually that growth has been even shorter than I thought, because you weren't really actually buying and selling until 2022.
Yep. Yeah.
So it's really only 2 years.
Exactly. Halfway through 22 is when we really started to exist in market. We had a wait list, which I'm not sure if we chatted about this last time, but it's just a funny example of why the patterns that work in technology generally, I think, are a little bit not nuanced enough for watches. Like we threw a wait list on the product in June of 22, and that wasn't received most positively because I think a lot of folks in the watch market are so tired of hearing the word waitlist because all their ADs put them on waitlists. And so it took us a little bit to figure that out. And then obviously we ripped that off in January of 23 and announced ourselves to the world.
So you mentioned that the watch business was really booming in 2021, and I think it still is, although I think we talked last time, it's a little bit calmed down a little bit. What's your kind of take on where watches as a whole are, particularly secondhand watches? Is it still a really crazy category to be in, or do you feel like it's a little calmer?
Yeah, I think in kind of pandemic times, you had a lot of new folks enter the market. It was a massive bull run for all collectibles, but certainly watches as well. And I love to use specific watches as examples of kind of price points, and I think they're indicative of the market. Like if you look at some of the hype pieces, like a ceramic kind of Panda Daytona, I think is the distillation of one of maybe 5 pieces that I think are the most hyped. And that was at the time like a 13.5, is what retail was on that watch. In 22, that was a $55,000 watch on the secondary watch market. I think it's now fallen down to probably a $32,000 watch brand new. And so, we're still operating in the double retail world, but obviously it's come down significantly from the peaks. I think what this did is a lot of new buyers entered the market and got really interested in watches in kind of the collectible times of COVID, and then stayed in the market. And I think what ends up happening is you start getting folks that were speculative, you start getting folks that evaluate like an asset class, and you also still have the same buyers that love watches because they love watches and they're going to collect no matter what. And so we saw a lot of collectors get really excited now that we have a bit of a correction in the market, where now I can start buying the pieces that I've been lusting for that were out of my price point. And then you see some buyers that were in it for the investment side that maybe are leaving the market, but it's still very frothy and it's still much larger than it was before the kind of pandemic times. So it's definitely stabilized a bit. I think a lot of the hype models are down, 40 some percent, but obviously still well above retail and still, very, very difficult to find a lot of the pieces.
Yeah. Are most of your watches above retail?
Not necessarily, right? Like, I think we obsess over the first-time watch buyer. And so a good chunk of our watches are Rolex, and a lot of our sports model Rolexes, APs, Pateks are trading above retail. But we're in the place where, like, a lot of precious metal Rolexes are now trading below retail again, as they were kind of pre-hype times. And a lot of the watches we sell, our average order value is just north of $10,000. So a lot of the watches we sell are Cartiers that are trading below retail, Omegas, things like that. So it's a good mix where we get a lot of those high in demand, really hyped, 5-figure, 6-figure, 7-figure pieces that are well above retail. And we also get the pieces that are more kind of collection starters that are an awesome discount for a first time buyer.
See, that's exactly what I was thinking is I think in luxury resale, there's kind of like, there's like the below retail product that's someone like, I really want a Rolex or I really want something from this brand and I can't get it new because I can't afford it. So I'll go to the secondhand market. And then the above retail stuff is like, I can afford it new. It's just not available. So that's like two different ways that people get into resale, I think.
Exactly. And I think our job is to cater the experience for both of those customers. And obviously our promise to all of our buyers is we authenticate everything. It ships to us first. So we make sure everything is working the way that it should and exactly what you would expect to put on your wrist. But, if you're a buyer that is sick of going to authorized dealers and being put on 5-year plus wait lists to get the watch that you want, like sometimes you just get ready to pay for it in the secondary market and it's worth that premium. And our job there is to take a customer experience that was otherwise frustrating and make it feel very easily accessible, very quick, very thoughtful, and very attentive. And then there are the customers that, want to watch that is available at retail, but, now we can offer them a discount. So our job is to typically reveal good news to the customer in as many ways as we possibly can.
Yeah. So what are the volumes you're dealing with? Because one of the things I wanted to ask you about is dealing with counterfeits and fakes. And I know you guys just released a big report that dives into that, among other things. But to start, just how many watches are coming through the platform every day?
Yeah, so we don't reveal the overall sales, but like the conduit for scale we always talk about is inventory. And at any point in time, we have north of 500 million in listings on the platform. So that's somewhere between 20 and 30,000 watches available at any point in time. As you can imagine, we're selling a large chunk of those every day. They're leaving the platform, they're coming back on. So the flow of watches is quite massive. And that's why it's so staggering that 24% of those that are attempted to be sold, we tend to flag. And these are watches that in many ways come from the top dealers in the US. And it falls anywhere on that spectrum of, it could be a downright fake. It could be something that has been modified and not, described the way it should. It could be the condition is wrong. It could be not functioning the way it should, where you're buying a dive watch that actually can't have any, waterproof qualities. It could have been reported stolen. Our whole goal is in all of these checks to make sure there's nothing wrong with either the value or the watch generally that you'd be purchasing.
Yeah. Is it still the case that people are making like those Franken watches? Because I remember hearing about that. Yeah, years ago from a authenticator at the RealReal was telling me how one of the hardest parts about authentication is you might have a watch where it's a real Rolex dial and a real Rolex case, but this dial and this case are from two different watches. And so it's like, it's fake, basically.
All the time. Like we see watches that are put together and sometimes it's not malicious where, the dealer has no idea this has been modified. And then sometimes it's very intentional where you'll have a Datejust, for example, that was born with a different dial and they'll swap it out with a green dial because it's more valuable, or they'll swap it out with a blue dial because it's more valuable, or a stone dial or whatever it is, especially when you get more vintage and rare pieces that, are less common. You can put them together and make it feel like you have a very amazing item to sell. So we see that all the time. And sometimes it's factory parts, like you'll take a real factory dial and swap it to create more value. And sometimes it's aftermarket cases, everything is completely swapped. Mm-hmm. We've had, $100,000 plus yellow gold Nautiluses come in with completely non-factory aftermarket bracelets that, some of the largest sellers in the world have no idea that have been modified. And I think that is the fun part about our job is, as you mentioned, these are really exciting purchases. People lust over these things. People obsess over them even, and they mean a lot for the buyer. And so to have to worry about spending $10,000+ on the internet and getting something that is not what you would expect is very scary. And so our promise to the buyers is to make sure that they don't have to worry about that.
Yeah. And online resale, I think, can be really scary as a buyer, like for exactly that reason. If you're dropping several $1,000s on something sight unseen and like hoping that the person on the other end is, coming to it honestly, that can be really intimidating. I think those platforms like you guys who have that kind of a gatekeeping, like we've looked into this, we've checked it, I think can be really valuable. I'm recently in the market for a new camera, specifically the Fujifilm X100V, which is like impossible to find anywhere. And I was like scouring Facebook Marketplace, and Facebook Marketplace is terrifying. It's so scary. Like they look so fake. I don't trust any of those things, you know? And so like I'm looking toward more like places like the equivalent of Bezel for a camera. There's lots of them like that, but I don't know. I would not trust, dropping $1,000 even through Facebook Marketplace. That feels like the Wild West there.
Yeah, I think that's what was shocking to me when I started collecting myself, and that's what ultimately was the genesis for starting this business. I'm a firm believer in verticalization when it comes to like really specialized goods, and cameras are a great example. I think watches are a great example. I was really inspired by what Goat and StockX had pulled off in the sneaker and kind of streetwear space, where I was a big sneaker collector before I was a watch collector. I like collecting things. It was obviously easier to afford some expensive sneakers than it was watches. So that was like what started my collecting journey. And prior to the existence of StockX and Goat, I was just getting burned on eBay and taking risks, and I never really felt confident with it. And then Goat and StockX existed. I bought into the brand ecosystem, and it was amazing. And all of a sudden, my collection grew a lot because I realized I had more purchasing power than I did because I felt comfortable, and then I didn't think I was taking risks, so I started purchasing. When I entered the watch space, my first bonus at Google job I had prior to this went to buying a Rolex, and it was very terrifying. It was like I didn't know who to buy from, and it was shop to seller, and then I would hear horror stories, and I would be told to look on the competitive marketplaces but never buy there because you can't trust anything. And it took me like 4 months to spend the amount of money I wanted to spend and buy the thing that I wanted. And that just felt insane to me. So as I started collecting, our bet was, how do we learn from the other verticals that have been able to pull this off in a little bit more of a mature way, build technology around that, build a brand that kind of stood for trust, and then ultimately allow, the customers that are interested in purchasing something to feel comfortable enough to pull the trigger. And the goal is like, could we scale the total addressable market by that? Could we generally just take folks that were sitting on the outskirts of the watch market, nervous to enter in, but always fascinated by that, like myself, and really grow the space? So that's kind of what we've been seeing right now. We love to say that I think the watch market doesn't focus enough on the first-time watch buyer, and they focus a lot on these whales, and it makes sense from an economics perspective. Like, I'm going to focus on the customer that, gives me 6 figures a year in sales. But every whale had to be a first-time watch buyer at some point. And so our bet is, if we build the trusted place for you to buy your first watch, scale the inventory to make sure we have everything in stock that you would ever want as you scaled your journey, we ultimately kind of build a moat around the next generation of whales in that sense.
Yeah, I literally was just working on a story this week, which will come out in the next couple of weeks, on that exact idea that a lot of luxury brands, I'm thinking particularly like primary brands rather than resale, but are so focused on their highest end, most affluent, like most loyal customer for exactly the reason you said. It makes sense. They're the ones who are spending. They're also, if they're really wealthy, they're probably insulated from any weird economic stuff. But like a lot of those people were an aspirational customer at one point. And if there's no entryway for an aspirational customer, and then when they become one of those, high net worth people and they have no relationship with this brand because they never like had it, a lot of times like everyone is a first time watch buyer at some point. So like there has to be something that caters to them.
The dynamics are changing a lot. Like we released in the report that you're referencing, 70% of our sales are millennial and Gen Z customers, and Gen Z accounts for our highest average order value group. So it's just skewing younger. The dynamics are changing. The way that people buy is changing. It's now oriented towards, I buy a watch and I trade in and out of those watches and I treat them like liquid assets. So building a market that optimizes for liquidity. And if you think about it right now, in kind of the pre-Bezel world, if I wanted to sell the watch that I bought on my wrist, I would have to go to some dealer and they would buy it from me, and they would take a 30-40% margin on me to make sure that they made money on the next transaction. And it was really hard for me to get liquidity out of my pieces. And so our goal is to not just be the best place for you to buy a watch from a trust perspective, but then allow you to get liquidity out of it if you want it by connecting you with another retail buyer, and that retail buyer trusts buying from you because we are the third party in between that authenticates everything. So it allows for true peer-to-peer in a way that hasn't existed prior to this. So that's the ultimate goal, is really looking down the line at how we think the watch market is shifting, and then compare ourselves to other verticals that I think are, a couple of years ahead of watches, and then try to make sure that we're building for where the ball is going versus kind of where it is right now.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great way to look at it. Something you mentioned a minute ago that I wanted to go back to, that you started in sneaker collecting and then moved to watches. And I think my anecdotal observation is that that's a very common path for especially a lot of like younger men, for exactly the reason you said. You can start collecting sneakers at a couple $100s per pair and maybe reselling if you want, or maybe just collect to have. And then watches are kind of like the natural next step. Do you find that that's a common pathway? And then are you guys doing anything around? Are you doing something with StockX right now? Or no, you're both working with Equinox, I think.
Yeah, we're both in the Equinox circle, but it certainly was an anecdotal pattern for me. We see a bit of it in the collecting journeys of some of our younger customers here as well. I think you're right that a lot of people have like the collecting bug. It's so funny though. Like I think have the collecting bug generally. Like I'm not a things person normally, but weirdly, sneakers made sense. I was working in tech, and I kind of dressed very comfortably every day at the office. So sneakers are a bit of my like moment of expressiveness and fun, and it felt like a cool way to elevate that. And then watches, I think the depth of watches for me took me over in that like they're very mechanical and super craft driven. And the fact that they last forever if they're well kept. And there's something so analog about it in the world that was otherwise very digital for me. Like I looked at computers all day, as kind of most of us do. And so that's what sucked me into watches. And I think like if you have this collector's bug, you're more inclined to collect multiple different things. But we also have folks that come in that have no interest in anything else. They're not car guys. They're not sneaker people. They're just deep in watches. And obviously that works as well.
Yeah. What about women? Do you have a significant female customer base? Is that something you're looking into at all?
I think it's a huge focus point for the watch market right now, and a huge focus point for us. And a lot of the early collecting process and kind of, merchandising process for us was to not gender the watches at all, right? Like there's this huge movement going on, and it's piloted by a lot of amazing content creators and folks that are connecting the space. Generally speaking, the watch market has been so male dominant from both a marketing and a consumption perspective. And I just think a lot of these brands are starting to realize like that's not right. And then it's also a huge growth opportunity for them to open up the doors and make it more accessible to everyone and more optimized for everyone. But you're getting kind of a mixed bag where you're getting a lot of male celebrities and tastemakers wearing really small watches. Like you're seeing the Cartier Crash being the most desirable watch, you could think of right now. And it's traditionally kind of certainly a more feminine piece, or if not a unisex piece, right? In a world where we spent, a number of years where everyone wanted the big Breitlings and the big watches and stuff. We're seeing it come back to smaller pieces. And you're seeing folks like, Tyler, the Creator, rocking, the Cartier Pebbles and things like that. And there's such a resurgence of stuff. So, and then you're also at the flip side, you're seeing women wear subs and Daytonas and typically men's kind of larger watches, and everything's kind of blurring in a really amazing way. And I think that's the right way for the watch market to feel. Our split is still largely male dominant. I think like we skew more blended than the industry average, and that's a huge focus point for us. But a lot of what we're trying to do is just create content around it that feels like, from a user education perspective, like we're making it accessible to everyone. And it's a long battle to make it feel more equitable, but it's something that we're super excited about from both a cultural perspective and also just a growth of the market perspective.
Yeah. Tyler, the Creator's Cartier collection, I find very admirable. I remember seeing that years ago. He's got such a cool collection of really like those small, like sleek, women's watches, and they look great.
Yeah, it's awesome. And then you're seeing a bunch of like AP is doing an amazing job with this too, where there's a lot of really, really exciting, hyped models that are collabs with influencers that typically cater towards a more kind of female dominant market. And I think they're doing a better job with these collabs than anyone else in the spaces right now. But like the Carolina Bucci's and like there's a lot of these like really amazing pieces that are captivating both men and women in a really exciting way. So it's changing a lot and it's changing fast. And I'm excited for kind of more of that change to continue to happen.
Yeah, for sure. One thing that I wanted to go back to from earlier on the topic of counterfeits and fakes, when you get stuff in that you know for your authenticator's looking at, you know for sure that it's fake, what do you guys do with it? Do you inform the seller and do you send it back to them? Do you keep it?
Yeah, this was kind of like our biggest fear when we were starting the business, right? Where before we were selling any watches, we knew that we would be protecting buyers. I didn't know, candidly, it would be kind of in 1/4 of the sale. Like, I thought it'd be much smaller. So if anything, this process has just made me more terrified of the watch market. But that was the biggest fear, because even if we're protecting you, right? Like, let's say for your wedding, you wanted to buy a watch and you were so excited about that watch and you ordered it. And like, if anyone's like me, whenever I order something, especially a watch, like I'm immediately staring out my window waiting for FedEx to show up because I want to put it on. And, we try to be as quick as possible. But then if we give you a call and we say, hey, the watch like had an issue here, that sucks. It's still a bummer of an experience because you feel like you're not going to ultimately get what you were expecting to get. And the cool part is, because our seller network is so vast and our ability to source things is so efficient at this stage, we have a really, really insanely high conversion rate on just getting you another piece that is at the same, quality or better at the same rate. And so typically the way the process works is, if you ordered something, it came to us, it had issues, we inform the buyer, and then we immediately replace it with a better example and get it off to you. And typically it delays the process by no more than a day. And so that's the exciting part, is we're able to kind of make that experience happen. And it's been the most visceral example for customers about why we exist. And typically those customers end up being our most loyal customers. So even though they had an experience where, their sale was maybe delayed or their purchase was maybe delayed a day, it ultimately makes them a customer for life, because they trust that we're actually taking this seriously and we're explaining to them in detail, this came in, the papers didn't smell right, it had been re-engraved, and it's a bit of like a mystery of how it was solved together. And I think that's just very fun from a customer experience. And on the seller side, we have a system where if you're a seller and it's a downright fake, like you're removed from the ecosystem. If it's, on the spectrum of not being fake, but it's an issue, it's kind of a case by case, but typically it's a point driven system. And the more that happens, their fees change and ultimately they're removed from the platform if it's a repeat offense.
Got it. No, that makes sense. Because like you said, sometimes there's malicious actors and sometimes there's someone who just like didn't realize that the thing they had. But no, I think you're so right that if I bought a watch through a platform and they halted the sale because like of an issue, I'd be annoyed in the moment, but I would be like, okay, they're not just saying that they're checking it out, because like it would be better for you if all of the sales went through without an issue. So it's like you said, it shows that you're actually taking it seriously if you halt things.
There's a lot of players in the space that have kind of experimented with authentication for a number of years. And the way that most folks have done it has been have some third-party service center be the authentication arm, and then it's completely external to the business. And I just think that's crazy. Like, the way that our process has to work is, if something comes in and there's an issue with it, the concierge individual that was working with the customer needs to be involved in that process, very hands-on, to go back to the customer and say, hey, like, this is what happened here. I'm going to work with you right now to source another one. Like, here's all the issues and storytelling. Like, the fact that everything for us is in-house and you have the authentication team sitting down the office from the concierge team, sitting down the office from the engineering team and the product team, like, it allows all of us to work really thoughtfully together to actually give the customer what they expect and have full transparency through that. So it's been working out very well that way. And we're super excited to kind of keep improving that process.
And then the watch itself, do you send it back? Do you destroy it, or what do you do?
Typically, if it's like something that like it's been reported stolen or things like that, the authorities are brought in and the insurance companies are typically brought in. If it's a watch that's kind of like on the fence and we don't want it, we typically send it back to the seller, but the seller just pays for the shipping and things like that. And even if it's a fake watch, it is oftentimes their property still. And so we just send it back and we say we want nothing to do with this watch.
Yeah. I can't remember who, but I remember talking to someone from another resale platform. I don't think it was watches. And they were like, sometimes they would inform the seller, like especially when it's one of those cases where it doesn't seem like it was intentional, they'll like inform the seller like, hey, just so you know, this is fake or like altered or something. And then the seller's like, oh, I don't want it anymore then. And then you're like kind of stuck with it.
That happens all the time, right? Where if the seller is being disingenuous, oftentimes they'll want it back. But if the seller is actually caught surprised, they tend to trust our take here. The reality though is it's typically kind of nuanced where a seller acting in good faith will buy a Rolex Datejust and 80% of the parts will be legitimate and those hold value. And then, 20% will be aftermarket or modified or whatever that is. Oftentimes we send that back and we mark that with the seller. We don't want to see it through the platform ever again, but it's up to them if they want to still get value out of 80% of the watch that they do have that ultimately they paid for, or they can use that to go back to wherever they got the watch and try to get their money back or whatever it is. For the watches that are 100% fake, most times the sellers are like, I want nothing to do with that. Don't send it back. It's not worth it. So.
Yeah. Cool. So I want to ask you a couple questions more sort of generally just about like business and like being a founder and things like that. Cause we mentioned, it seems like Bezel has really like kind of grown really fast in terms of listings or like, merchandise going through. It definitely feels like it's grown a lot, but has the team expanded a lot? Have you been hiring a lot, or is it still like a tight team? What's the internal kind of situation looking like?
I think we try to keep it as lean as we possibly can. I think gone are the times where, in the 2021 kind of market where we were born and bred from a seed perspective, where it was almost like founders comparing how big they could scale their team as like a vanity metric to impart success or the perception of success. I think that's very much gone. And so we've been really lucky to scale very intentionally. We're still a really small team, specifically for like the revenue and the scale that we were doing. And our focus there is just like, hiring in a way where we're making sure that, there needs to be, we're pushing it to the point where we're like, we really need more help here. And then we're scaling at that point. We're not like hiring preemptively, and we're hiring very kind of senior oriented. So our whole focus was getting a bunch of killers in the office that have run respective teams in the past, but also are really hungry to just roll their sleeves up and get back in the weeds and build a startup. So we've been super lucky to have a lot of high performers here. And I just think a lot of our long-term competitive advantage, specifically in an industry like luxury and watches, is just, I think there's not a ton of technology companies through and through that operate in the space. I think it's like typically folks that come from more of a background in luxury and trying to strap on, or watches and try to strap on a technology arm. I think we did it the inverse, where like our empathetic point for customers is that I didn't come from the watch world. Like I don't have these connections in the watch space. We had to build them through the business. And so culturally speaking, it's a bit of a fun mix where we get folks in a conference room to solve a problem. And it's, Google and ex-Amazon engineers in the same room with, ex-Sotheby's, ex-Christie's, auction house, kind of watch authenticators and savants in the same room trying to hack on problems and figure out like what the future of the watch market is doing. So it's a bit of a mix of technologists and watch folks and different degrees of expertise along that spectrum. So we have a super in-house office culture. So majority of the team comes in every day. I think that's super important for cultural bonding and just generally grinding together. We are very like brainstorm centric. And so super open office, a lot of times on the whiteboard, a lot of like, minds trying to solve the same problem. Obviously, we have our authentication center close to our office. So every single time a watch comes in, it's a cool moment where, as we can see the scale of the business in a very visceral way, it's really easy for our employees to see the packages that are going in and out change. And so, I think that's the way we kind of think about it. And we were all first-time founders in this process. We've all worked at, myself, Chase, and Daryl, my two co-founders, have worked in different organizations. And so a lot of this has been learning from our previous experiences and what we liked, but ultimately kind of learning from our mentors and our earliest employees, kind of what is the culture that's important to them and trying to be as true to that as possible as we grow.
Yeah. Is it pretty flat at the moment then in terms of like hierarchy? It sounds very collaborative the way you're describing it. So.
Yeah, I think like we try to keep it as flat as possible in a very senior way. Like we want to get a bunch of people that we feel like could easily build teams underneath them. And a lot of them have started to do that flow. Like, it'd be impossible for us to say like we are keeping it entirely flat. But yeah, I think like not a lot of folks are focused on title. It's really about, we like to think that we raised a decent amount of capital and we're doing a meaningful amount of sales, but like we're just leaving the garage is kind of the way that we feel like it. Like we're not building into the garage anymore. We have the resources and the product market fit and the flywheel spinning, but like culturally speaking, we're trying to hold on to that small company feel as long as we can, just because it's been so productive and so scrappy and dynamic that it's allowed us to kind of outpace the competitors. And I think we want to be in a place where we can keep doing that as long as possible.
Yeah. And you mentioned kind of like doing as much as you can with what you have, and then only expanding when you truly like, find a need for it. Is there any area that you right at the moment feel like is a priority, marketing or merchandising, any of that kind of stuff?
I think like we're at an amazing point where we spent the last year building foundation, and now this year has been spent on like truly innovating on top of that foundation. So a lot of what we spent this year scaling out the engineering team so that we have the resources to build up the technology that we're super excited about. Like our laundry list of things that we want to do and keep building is so vast. We launched auctions this year that has kind of changed the game for us and certainly changed our funnel for first-time customers. There's a number of these features on the buy side and the sell side that we're really, really interested in. So scaling a lot on the technology team. And then I think the big focus right now is the holidays is pretty much the Super Bowl for the watch market. And last year we, more than doubled between summer and the holidays. And so it's like a very big point for the business. And so a lot of my mentality right now is starting to think, are we ready for November, December, Black Friday through the holiday season, and making sure that we're staffed for, a pretty massive increase in kind of watches coming in and out. So I think that's a lot of the focus, is just scaling up the team to make sure that we're kind of preemptively ready for that.
Yeah. The other kind of like big topic I wanted to ask you about is how you guys are marketing the company, because, like we said, you've got a lot of merchandise and you've got a lot of growth in a short period of time. And it seems like the internal structure feels pretty solid. And now that you've got the foundations kind of set, I feel like usually the startup path is like, that's when you start marketing really hard. And you mentioned you've got like a strong base of like younger consumers, which I think is great. But what's your approach for marketing? Is there certain certain channels you're looking at, or like you want to do more organic or more paid influencer stuff? I know you have J Balvin as an investor, which feels like a great kind of just name to have associated with the company.
Yeah. So I think the way that we started from the beginning was, it's like what I said in the very beginning of the podcast, where like what we are trying to sell is trust, and we're selling really expensive items. And the combination of those two things, I think, takes time, right? Like a lot of folks are out there talking the talk. And I think true luxury brands and true trust is built largely from walking the walk. And so a lot of our obsession has been not doing anything too fast and not doing anything too loud too early, to make sure that like we have the credentials in the team and the pedigree to substantiate what we are saying. So we've been obsessing over Trustpilot, for example. Like, every client is paired with a concierge, a real person on the team that just feels like emphatically different than any other e-commerce or marketplace experience that you've had. Like, there's a person that knows your name. They sit in the office. They are readily available to take care of you. So it's allowed us to be, the highest rated marketplace in the space on Trustpilot, and obsessing over those reviews and making sure everything is feeling right. From a referral perspective, our best customers come from our existing customers. So making sure that we're creating a really shareable experience and things that are worth, remarking on and things like that. From a paid spend perspective, a lot of our focus over the last year and a half was from a kind of CAC and a unit economics perspective. We wanted to build a really fundamentally strong business. So when I say back to like the last year being foundation building, it was, making sure the CAC was some of the lowest in the industry. It dropped 70% last year, and a meaningful amount this year already. So a lot of the focus is bringing the CAC down to a place that, now we're in a really, really fundamentally strong position from a unit economics perspective and scaling the business out. And to your point, exactly, it's like now that you're at that point and the flywheel is spinning and the economics make sense, like now is when we really turn on the fire there. We started in the beginning with the celebrity approach that you mentioned. So, everyone from J Balvin to Kevin Hart to John Legend to Steve Aoki and Kyle Kuzma, Michael Ovitz, Michael Rubin, like these big names that I think stand for quality, trust, and modern watch collecting, allowed us to build a brand before we had one. We focus a lot on partnerships. So you mentioned the Equinox partnership, but a lot of amazing partnerships with brands in kind of luxury, hospitality, banking, wealth management, things like that, where they give us an unfair advantage in acquiring customers and using their brands to do so. And then organic's really big for us as well. So A lot of it is telling the story of why we are different from an authentication perspective and a concierge and a product perspective. We partner with a lot of influencers in the watch space. We allow a podium for them to tell their story. We have this property called Come Collect where we go out and we talk about the collector and kind of share it on our mutual channels, and it allows us to grow kind of organically through that. But you're spot on that, the last couple months have been very much an inflection point for the business where marketing has been a huge focus. And I think certainly the holidays and then 2025 will be a big moment for us. We're currently only US only. So we've done a lot of growth in the US, and there's still a ton of juice to squeeze in the US. We're very excited about taking internationally next year. So a lot of growth kind of hopefully on the horizon for us.
I think you guys took the right approach, which is figuring out the product and the business model first and then marketing it, rather than the unfortunately very common market it first and then figure out how to make it profitable or make money off of it later, which is maybe less common. But I feel like for a while there were a lot of startups that were like that. They came out of the gate spending everything on marketing and were like, the product will just come naturally or something, and then never figured it out.
Yeah, and I not to say that that's not necessarily the right way to do it. I just think it's industry and vertical specific, right? I come from very much a software product design technology world, and the old trope is move fast and break things, the kind of Facebook style of growth. And there's all these quotes where you hear, if you're kind of an early stage founder, that are kind of focused on, if you're happy with your product, you didn't launch it early enough. It's the old saying. And I think that's totally true. If we're building a SaaS platform for so-and-so, or we're building a social network, whatever it is, I think the margin for error is different. If we're trying to sell you a $10,000 thing on the internet and you're terrified normally, I don't think we can mess up. We don't have the same margin there. So what I always tell founders is none of these bucketed large sayings that exist for every technology founder are the same. It's not a one size fits all. It's okay to be the business that is slower moving from a launch perspective, but then grows faster once you launch. It's okay to be the business that says, we're not going to go international for 2 years because we don't feel like it's perfect yet, right? And so a lot of our focus is there. And AI is a great example. The amount of businesses that we've been pitched that are kind of AI authentication or whatever, our emphatic statement externally has been, you can never use artificial intelligence to authenticate a watch the way that we have. We are not an AI business. We leverage it the same way that a lot of businesses do to augment certain, personalization metrics or anything we can do to make the product more optimized and better. And we use it a ton, and we have all these engines that we've built. But we're always going to be a business that takes artisans, hires them, and gets watches in the hands of them to make sure things are authentic. And it's a bit of a new world versus old world. And I think that's okay. that is our competitive advantage. And right. So a lot of these kind of growth tools are very specific to the industry that you're in.
Yeah. I mean, I've heard this often, but I think it can be just as useful to define what your company is not in addition to what it is, and these are things we will not do. That's an important kind of thing. Quaid, I think that's all the time we have this week, but that was a great conversation. Thank you so much for being here, and thanks for sharing all your insight.
Awesome. Super fun, and thanks for having me back.
Yeah, and for those of you listening, thank you for being here with us, and don't forget to give us a rating and a review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, wherever you listen to this, because that helps us out so much. And don't forget to subscribe to the Glossy Podcast, because you'll hear interviews with industry insiders like Quaid every Wednesday, and week in review episodes with me, and sometimes also with Quaid every Friday. But until the next time, thank you all for listening, and thank you, Quaid, for being here.